Welcome to the France 34 debate. I'm Mark Owen. May the 1st is International Workers' Day. There have been marches and demonstrations across the world in recognition, in honour and in defence of everyone who toils hard for a living. Here in France, it's all crystallised and referred to as the Fête du Travail. And this May Day falls in the middle of the most controversial set of reforms in decades and the strikes and industrial action that the plans have provoked. In this debate, we'll be examining where we are with the retirement reform row, and we'll be paying more than a passing reference to what's happening elsewhere in the world. But let's start here in the studio and introduce to you our special guests. And this is in no order of preference because everybody is equally welcome around this table. Lex Paulson, Executive Director at the School of Collective Intelligence at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco. Great to see you, sir.
Good to be back.
On the other side of our studio, Richard Verly, who's international columnist, but I know for a fact France and Europe correspondent with Blick magazine. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you, Mark.
And Claire Lejeune is a member of the NUPES left-wing coalition. Claire, great to see you too. Thanks for joining us here on the debate. Before I set these three loose, let's take a look at how May Day here in France has panned out.
In cities across France, Labor Day was not just a day off work this year, but a chance for hundreds of thousands of people to express their frustration. The nation's labor unions called for a 13th day of action against Emmanuel Macron and his government's raising of the retirement age from 62 to 64, a law already on the books and pushed through last month without a vote in Parliament.
We're here to send a clear message to the government. We've had enough. We tried all the democratic methods to stop it, and it's wrong.
It's May 1st, Labor Day, and we can't lose the rights we've been fighting for all these years, and we have to do something.
In places, the protests got out of hand. In Nantes, riot police fired tear gas on protesters after some of them threw projectiles at officers. And in Paris, bicycles were set on fire and several activists were arrested after they splashed the Justice Ministry with orange paint. Emmanuel Macron has desperately been trying to turn the page since invoking a rule enabling him to enact the reform without a vote by lawmakers. But union leaders say they're backing a new effort to nullify the law.
We can see that the page will not be turned until this pension reform is withdrawn. We have a determination to win, and it's good because there's a deadline on June the 8th, and we intend to win the repeal of this reform.
With the Constitutional Council already turning down a request for a public referendum, Macron's opponents are pinning their hopes on a vote in the Assembly in June, when a group of deputies is expected to put forward a bill to repeal the law.
Since that report by Monty Francis, Elizabeth Borne, the Prime Minister of France, has said that she judges it unacceptable, the behaviour of some of the protesters on the streets. Let's bring in Claire Lejeune from the NUPES left-wing coalition. Just for international viewers, Claire, tell us what NUPES is, tell us who you are, tell us what you stand for and what you think about the retirement reforms.
Okay, so I was a candidate for the last elections for National Assembly under the banner of the NUPES. I did the campaign for JeanLuc Melenchon, so he was at the head of the left.
So he's the leader of the far left, La France Insoumise, as it's called. France
Yes,
Unbowed, okay.
Exactly. And I'm also a researcher in political science.
Okay.
And so globally, this retirement reform scheme is something that has spurred much anger in the country. If you take the long term, basically, the government tried to push it through using tools that are allowed by our constitution, but that are very brutal on the democratic aspect
This is
of
the
it.
Article 49.3,
Exactly.
which essentially is a presidential
But
decree, isn't it?
It was already introduced through a kind of a different form of law, which is very controversial as well. So this created quite a united front on the union side and also in civil society. So we had massive demonstrations for months, and the 1st of May demonstrations is just like the continuation of this process.
Demonstrations beginning in December, not long after Macron was re-elected, of course. All 8 major unions in France are behind this. They do not want to see the pension reforms enacted, but they have been, as you say, pushed through without a vote.
Yes, exactly. The unions' united front is something very important because last retirement reform scheme, they weren't united. This time they have been all through the process, and they've been standing in front of millions and millions of French people who are in their vast majority against this pension scheme reform. So, facing this, the government has continued to push through, has not heard or seen anything that has been happening in the country, has chosen very brutal methods, and there's been also a lot of police violence. We've seen spontaneous demonstrations being repressed with terrible images and lots of young people demonstrating, and a whole generation that is going to be traumatized by these images.
It's not just so our viewers know, it's not just you, Claire, saying that. The United Nations has raised the issue of police brutality in these demonstrations in France. So it's not just a political issue that you might be bringing up. It's actually the UN saying that. Can I pause you and bring in Lex Paulson? Lex, you're from the School of Collective Intelligence at Mohammed VI Polytechnic in Morocco, executive director there. But, do I call you a Macronist?
I supported Macron and worked very hard in his campaign. It was a campaign in his first instance based around something close to collective intelligence, of idea of decentralizing the creation of his campaign program, creating new forms of participation, including the citizens' assemblies, including the Grand Débat, including participatory budgeting. However, the Réforme de la Retraite, the retirement reform, shows a kind of a paradox at the heart of Emmanuel Macron. That on the one hand, he believed in a different kind of politics, a different kind of governing, breaking up the established political order. On the other hand, his personality is very much an I know best way of governing, and it both symbolically and politically has alienated the majority of French people. As Claire said, there was nothing unconstitutional or remotely illegal in how this reform was enacted. This was a power of the French presidency under the Fifth Republic that was created in response to the parliamentary chaos of the Fourth Republic. So there was a reason why this kind of power exists in extraordinary circumstances. It's been used by other governments as well, and had been used several times before this. So no one's saying that Emmanuel Macron didn't have the right to do what he did on the Constitution, but Claire makes the point, if a majority of people are against you, and a majority of the elected representatives are against you, and you still can't call a vote and get a coalition on your side, you have to ask the question, is this a reform worth enacting? And Emmanuel Macron said absolutely it was. And I think he's badly misjudged the need to bring the French people along with a reform this difficult. He wasn't seen very much in public, and he let the prime minister do the work. And I think we're seeing his very poor political judgment in this case.
Lex, thank you for now. Let's bring in Richard Verley from Blick magazine. Richard, sometimes you can say that issues are left-wing or right-wing or centre in some way, but if you sort of take those three columns like that, am I right in saying this issue cuts right across all that in a different direction?
Probably. The paradox of today, on May Day, on Labour Day, is that the mobilization has probably not been as good as the trade union expected it to be.
2.3 million people?
Yeah, but it has not been the largest protest since the beginning of the year. The largest was in March. So, on a way, Macron could say that mobilization is winding down a bit. The difficulty is what you see is the violence in Paris, and the cameras of all over the world are there witnessing this violence, and the fact that the trade union still do not want to accept the hand of Emmanuel Macron. He has opened the door. He has said that you can come back and negotiate again with me on other issues like a labor law, a future labor law. The Prime Minister has said the same, but the trade unions are not yet ready. So what strikes me as a foreign correspondent is you have no ground at the moment for reuniting the country, for bridging the gap. You have the gap in front of you. Macron is sitting on the fence, on the edge, and he has no way to bridge it.
It's a very strange situation. You mentioned about the eyes of the world on Paris. I was in Ukraine in February covering the anniversary of the beginning of Russia's invasion, and Ukrainian people said to me, is it dangerous in Paris?
Well, it's not dangerous in Paris today. I mean, most of the capital city, but on the Place de la Nation, where the protest was supposed to end, it's been difficult throughout the day. We understand that on the social media there are calls for meeting tonight at the Place de l'Opéra. So there is a sense in the air that at any moment it could degenerate, it could aggravate. And I think that's a problem for Emmanuel Macron. He wants to pacify the country, that's what he says, but he has no way to do so at the moment.
These images, as you're talking, are what we're seeing, sort of recent images coming in. Earlier, we saw online a police officer hit by a Molotov cocktail engulfed in flames. We couldn't show that for a number of reasons, but clearly it's indicative of possibly the worst incident that's happened. From your perspective, Claire, representing the NUPES left-wing coalition, who are very much active in these demonstrations, I suspect you're going to completely condemn any violence that we've seen.
Yes, so of course there's a condemnation of the violence that happens in demonstrations, because demonstrating is a constitutional right. So any situation in which there's a violence in demonstration is problematic in our democracy. But we've heard this a lot as soon as the pension reform passed, and there was spontaneous demonstrations and so much police violence towards the demonstrations. The whole of the Macronist political spectrum came and said, now you need to condemn the violences, now you need to condemn the violences. And the fact is, if you take the long-term process, the unions were saying constantly, please listen to us. We're using all the democratic tools we have in hand. We're doing demonstrations, pacific demonstrations that were calm for the whole of this process. And the government would not hear this. So it's a little easy and maybe a little unfair to now ask all the political responsibles to actively condemn these violences, whereas there's also violence on the part of the police, and the situation of crispation and anger that we see here is the result of this long process in which clearly the government did not hear what was happening in the country, and the level of refusal that there was of this pension plan reform.
You're echoing what Lex was saying about the fact that Macron's got it wrong. His judgment's been wrong. I think you're echoing what he was saying.
Yes, and the problem is that he's got a way of governing in which he seems to think that he's in any case right, and that the French people will maybe end up understanding what he wants to do, but that in any case he's going to push forwards with his reforms because they are right. But I think in a democracy you can't be right against your people. You can't have a situation where you have to govern by cowering from your people, when at each time you move from one place to another you have to have a huge security disposal, because people are here with saucepans protesting against the coming of all the ministers and of the president at each time he makes an appearance somewhere.
I mean, there is an answer to that, in a sense that, my international friends have said, well, why in the world is France complaining about a slightly changed retirement age when the French already retired much earlier than every other country? I think the interesting question that we need to address is what in our political system allows us to solve long-term problems, and it's simply the case that any part of society that stands to lose from a reform will resist it. And we don't know to what degree. I mean, 2 million people is a lot of people, but in a country of 60 million people, do those 2 million people speak for the other 58 million? Do they speak for our children who are going to be saddled with the debt, or we're going to have less generous retirement benefits if we don't fix the system? And Emmanuel Macron, I think his failure of judgment is not trying to address long-term structural problems. I think that's the right thing to do. His failure of judgment is not making a more collaborative effort to bring the country and bring the average citizen and the voice of the average citizen along in this process, because it's simply the case. France is an aging country. The ratio of workers to retired people is shrinking, and I don't hear people on the left or the unions talking about a massive increase in skilled immigration, which would be another way of solving the problem. So simply saying we have to raise taxes on rich people, which are already the highest in Europe, is not a responsible solution to a long-term structural problem. I don't think Macron has done it the right way, but I haven't seen on the left, and certainly I'm afraid from JeanLuc Melenchon, better ideas on how to fix this long-term problem.
So there's a lack of thinking, but I'm saying you, it's not you, Lex, it's put yourself in Macron's shoes. Do you get it when, say, the guy who empties my bins where I live outside Paris, I mean, he's in his 60s, and he swings off his bin wagon. He shouldn't mean that at the age 60, but he's going to go a lot further and a lot further, perhaps. He's saying, well, I'm probably not going to get any pension. I'll probably die before I can get there. You understand what that's about?
Sure, and I've heard Elizabeth Braun. I mean, she's not an Obama-level political communicator, but she's a very, very smart woman, and she's defended the reform substantively about certain carve-outs for manual labor, for the length of working in manual jobs. But I think there needs to be more empathy for people like that bin collector that you talk about. Unfortunately, I don't think the protests accomplish anything productive for that sanitation worker. I mean, I have the benefit of teaching students who are much more intelligent than I am at Sciences Po, and they've educated me a little bit on what's the value of being in the street for these protests. There isn't a real political impact, so we can put that value aside. But they say there is also a pedagogical and educative impact, that people who go to these protests, they're learning from their peers. Maybe younger people are learning from older people. Maybe they're raising awareness in the grand public and the general public of these issues. That has value. But in May 1st, when this reform is already passed, I'm not sure that has much value anymore in French society. And then the third is just purely therapeutic. People go into the streets because they feels good to do something. But as we've seen, it can easily spiral out of control. These shop owners in the Place de la Nation, they weren't responsible for Macron's reform. What in the world does it help to throw Molotov cocktails into a fruit and vegetable shop? But unfortunately, that's where we are with the limited level of participation available to French citizens right now. And that's why we need both political reforms and democratic reforms in this country.
Indeed. What I've never understood is why in these demonstrations someone sets on fire someone's second-hand Renault Twingo when, in fact, that person needs the car to get to work. It just seems like you're attacking your own sort. That's the wrong kind of thing. Richard?
True. Well, what I'm worried at the moment is the lack of a visible political outcome. And I find it very worrying. Look at on the economic front. There was a logic, and there is still a logic in Macron's reform, which is considering the level of public debt in France, you need to reform the country to convince the financial market to continue to lend you money. Well, it didn't materialize because recently the Fitch rating agency decided to downgrade France. So the economic benefit of the reform is already gone in a way. And politically speaking, Macron has said that he has given 100 days, les 100 jours, to his Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne to appease and relaunch the country. It will take her to the 14th of July, National Day, French National Day, Bastille Day. Well, who could believe that in 100 days, France will get calmer and things, concretely speaking, will be able to advance? So I'm worried about that because viewed from Germany, United Kingdom, Switzerland, we see France at the moment not yet as a broken country, but as a country in difficulty. And Macron, who intends to be a European leader, he continues to speak in favor of European sovereignty. There is a war in Ukraine. Like it or not, his international stature and credibility is affected by what's going on in France at the moment.
Inevitably, that happens.
Inevitably.
Inevitably, that's
Inevitably.
You can't escape
that does not mean that other countries don't have problems. They have also their set of problems. But at the moment, Macron is clearly weak.
And it's like you're saying, it's when you see that on TV, internationally, worldwide, it reflects, doesn't it?
Once again, like it or not, but there are certain pictures that remains in mind. A few weeks ago, this was the bin in Paris, the garbage in Paris, which were not taken care of. Now you've got this shop in flame, Place de la Nation. And I think that's bad news for France. So I understand what Claire is saying about the motivation of the protesters, but viewed by an international correspondent, I can say it's bad news for the country.
I'd just like to add, you mentioned the rubbish that was left on the streets in Paris. Where I live, they actually continued emptying the bins. So I just want to sort of clarify that in case my bin man's watching. He's a great guy, honestly. Claire, can I bring you in? Because obviously we heard Richard there talking about the 100 days.
Yeah.
Is there going to be a difference? And I think he's answered the question already, but I'm asking you, from your perspective, between now 100 days, is there going to be a difference in France?
Yeah.
Will things have changed? Will Elizabeth Borne succeed in making things calmer?
Well, there's a very simple way of making things much calmer, which is to abandon this pension plan reform. And what we've really got to understand is that the movement is far from being over. people are determined to keep going, to keep taking the streets, to keep protesting wherever the ministers will go. So it's far from being over. And so these 100 days that Macron has given Elisabeth Borne to appease things, it sounds like a joke, really, because if you look at the content that was described by Elisabeth Borne when she was talking about the 100 days, it's basically measures that were already planned, but they've just made a new package and said, right, we're going to use ecological planning and we're going to talk about work, etc., etc. But there's nothing new. There's no new means, human or financial, to deal with the crisis that our country is going through. And it's kind of a way of saying, OK, we're going to act, we're going to do things, whereas what the country needs right now is appeasement and maybe finding a way to reopen the debate on the essential and profound questions that this movement is trying to put on the table. And I heard all your arguments on the economic basis for this reform, but the contestation is also on those economic bases, because in a world where there's this massive climate crisis, in a world where the whole of our economic model is being criticized for being responsible for this, a whole generation is growing up not knowing if they're going to have a pension plan, but also not knowing if they're going to have a livable planet. So these are very deep questions about the nature of work, the nature of our economy, the nature of value in our society. And it's all these questions we're not going to be able to avoid in decades to come. And Macron is not going to be able to fly over them with his 100 days, which won't resolve anything, without accepting to go back to these fundamental questions, because his election, he got elected the second time, again, to counter the National Front. And the risk here is that if he doesn't hear the level of anger and frustration there is in the country, there's going to be even more defiance when next election comes around. And I don't know if we're going to manage to convince people to turn out again and vote against the National Front. So we're in this situation, and I think I place a lot of hope in the continuation of this social movement, because I think it's very creative politically. And as you were saying, going to a demonstration, I believe demonstrations have also a political impact, and it's May Day today, and we should all remember that it's Workers' Rights Day, and these rights were only gained because workers fought, they did demonstrations, they mobilized. So no, I think there's a real political gain we can get by demonstrating, by organizing, by thinking collectively. And I think that's the huge richness of the moment we're living. And Macron would be so wrong to not hear what's going on here.
Indeed, May Day in Moscow represents something different, doesn't it, if you think about that angle, given what's going on in Ukraine?
I would not completely agree with what Claire was just saying. I understand there is passion in this movement, and certainly the protesters do believe that this pension reform is unfair, and in many ways it may be. But what I'm seeing in Paris again, what I'm seeing in Nantes, what I'm seeing in Lyon, I mean, the violence, the level of violence, the level of anger, the brutality on both sides.
People are
Frankly
angry.
Speaking,
people are very angry.
Yeah, well, I may be too Swiss, too foreign in that respect, but I don't consider it a good news for the country. The country doesn't need this at the moment. France has obvious economic difficulties. It has obvious economic problems. There is good employment climate at the moment. A lot of companies are hiring people. They can't even find people to work. Not enough. A lot of jobs are being kept vacant. So, and a large part of the country is not protesting. So I'm not saying that the protests are not legitimate. I do understand the concern. But again, do we realize in what situation it is putting the country at the moment?
It's the style. It's the style of the protest.
Yeah, I'm quite afraid of what I'm seeing and what could happen in the coming days.
Lex,
yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
It's May Day, right? And so we should, as you say, we should celebrate what protests like this in the past have produced. That there would not be a minimum wage, there would not be a 35-hour work week, there would not be protections for children, women, retired people, had it not been for French people who had taken the streets. However, it's very possible that the same tactics that won those rights in the 19th and 20th centuries are not the ones we need in the 21st century. You talk about creativity. I think we need much more creativity and more leadership from the left in this country about how we make the hard choices about redesigning our economy in the face of climate change, consuming less, wasting less, and frankly, just saying no to things doesn't strike me as leadership. A revolutionary banner that says status quo forever is not one that I want to march behind. And unfortunately, since Mitterrand, since the 1980s, it's been a defensive action as opposed to a creative action. I would much rather see people like yourself, Claire, and younger people on the left, and not, unfortunately, the unreconstructed leftists like Melenchon, proposing new ideas for how France can solve problems and be in a mode of problem solving as opposed to simply contesting. Contesting has achieved great things in France in the past. I don't think it's the key to achieving the next great successes for the country.
But that's exactly what I meant, is that in this contestation, it wasn't purely contestation. It was no, indeed, to the age of 64 to get a retirement fund, because it's the least fair way of reforming the system. It's basically making everyone go to 64, whereas the diversity of situations in the workplace is incredible. So that's what was contested. But behind that, there was a whole positive view of what our economy should be and what work should be and what also the difference between free time and work time should be. So, and the left, be it the unions or be it the political parties united in the NUPES, they constructed a platform that millions of people went out and voted for. So there are ideas circulating. And on this question, there was many suggestions of how we could fund some parts of the pension plan so that we wouldn't have to go through the age reform. And even on a purely economic basis, the Conseil d'orientation des retraites also pointed out, so it's an independent circle that annually, I think, produces a report on the state of our pension plan. And they were saying there's no absolute need to reform our system right now on a financial basis. So I think we're in a moment where we've got to think widely out of the box of the tools that we've inherited from liberalism and neoliberalism. And that's what the left is doing, and that's what the social movement is doing, and that's what the whole young generation is trying to do as well, because otherwise we're going to just carry on the same path, which is basically the path that Macron is trying to push down our throats right now. And it's going to lead us to a wall, be it on the climate issue, be it on the social issue. So we've got to do this work of rethinking. Maybe it's not enough yet, but clearly there were positive answers. It's not just a no. It's a no that contains a huge yes to another way of seeing our society and the economy.
Can I just sort of throw something into the argument here? It comes from the UK, where the rail union was criticised going back many weeks now for not accepting an offer of 7% pay rise during the strikes that were going on there. Mick Lynch was the man who was doing the negotiations, who was emerged as possibly the leader of the unofficial leader of the left in the UK. So they were criticised for not taking the 7%. They ended up getting 15% as a pay rise. I've got family who work on the railway, so I know the ins and outs of all of this, and they're active in the unions. So basically, that was old school kind of like digging in and saying, we're going to do this and we're going to go on strike. And that worked. Lex, why hasn't it worked here? What's the issue? Why isn't it working?
Look, I mean, unions, again, should be strong. Workers should be well represented. However, we need to invent, I think just to use this word creativity, we need to invent new forms of participation that go beyond representative structures. And I've worked with unions, I've worked inside unions, I've worked in parliaments with unions. So, I mean, I am a huge defender of the importance of unions in order to defend the rights of workers, as you say. However, there are some unions that aren't terribly representative. There are many workers who are not represented in those negotiations. I think more of them should be unionized. But I will also say this. We have in France a different model of representation of everyday citizens representing other everyday citizens, and it's through what we call citizens' assemblies. Now, Macron convened the first one of these on to reduce the climate emissions, carbon emissions, and they produced a projet de loi that was watered down by the assembly. But it showed these 150 citizens randomly selected, supported by experts of of all ideologies and kinds, were able to produce very strong recommendations. And a second citizens' assembly of a new group of 180 citizens, randomly selected, produced recommendations on end-of-life care. So these are examples, concrete examples of everyday citizens randomly selected, brought together to represent their fellow citizens, producing this kind of outside-of-the-box creative solutions to public problems that sometimes established actors, or from the unions, from business, from civil society, are stuck in their positions. And so sometimes you need everyday people to break some of these silos. And that's, I think, the model of the future.
Lex speaks in a very inspirational way, and I can understand why you're as valued as you are in what you do completely. I really can, because what you're saying, to me, it makes a great deal of sense. But as we're talking, there are images on the streets of people who aren't thinking in a creative way, and they're causing damage. And these people are really angry, and their feelings are very relevant. Their feelings are important. Their situation is important. And many people, of course, can't make ends meet. This is a whole sequence of things coming together, isn't it?
Well, I would pose this question because, I mean, maybe the three of us have had experiences in manifestation. The violent side of a manifestation. I was in one of the protests with the Gilets jaunes in the end of 2018. The black blocs, and there were a lot of black blocs, anarchists, and they're professional agitators, you could say. It's not the majority. It's never the majority of protesters. But it's also not so simple to say that, as you say, that angry people don't want something destroyed, even if they're not the ones destroying it. That the frustration, the kind of the spectrum of frustration includes people who are there shouting, peacefully, and those who are throwing things, and those who are throwing things on fire. And it's not as easy as you might think to draw a clean and clear line in between those groups. But as you say, if people are angry and they don't have any other way of expressing it, then you can see how it could boil over. It doesn't excuse, I think, the terrible strategy of putting Molotov cocktails either on the police or in the shop windows of small businesses. But I'm curious as to what, I mean, Claire is probably a bit more sympathetic to these protesters. I mean, can you excuse that level of violence? Does it do any good?
Before Claire answers that question, can I just drop into here before this is relevant to what you're going to say? At least 108 police officers injured, 291 people detained in France this May Day. Yeah. To you.
Yes, this is the second time that I've been asked the question of do I excuse the violences, etc. And my answer is clear: no. In the demonstration, there should be no violences. But once again, we've got to take into account the whole process that has been going on here. We've had, in a democracy, the basis of the social contract is we talk, we agree on what we disagree on, and we move forwards in a constructive way. Here we've had unions that have organized pacific demonstrations for months on end, and we have a government which has not heard at all what they had to say. So people, when we're coming after a moment where we've had the Gilets jaunes as well, and so there's that level of frustration is translating today into something that can seem more violent. And once again, there's always been the Black Bloc at the head of protests. And I don't know if there's a widely more important level of destruction in these protests. There's always been forms of violence that aren't in the traditional ways of demonstration that we usually have when there's unions involved. So what we've got to see is the level of violence that there is at a demonstration also depends on the way that the police are managed, the orders that they have. And to start with, we saw a shift when Didier Lallemand, so the former préfet of Paris, stepped down and there's someone new. Demonstrations were much calmer. There was less tear gas. The strategy was less aggressive from the police. And we saw this change again when there started to be spontaneous demonstrations in Paris after the 49.3. And this has escalated the level of tension in demonstrations, and up to a point where in these demonstrations in which normally families could come, old people could come. Now people are starting to be scared to come to demonstrations again. And I can't hear that the only responsibility of this is the forms of urban violence that we've always seen in demonstrations, and that it's the policeman's job to know how to canalise and to protect other demonstrators from it.
Indeed, because they're actually policing not just for themselves, but for the good of the whole community. Let's just take a look at how policing is unfolding here in France, because the United Nations has raised a big issue about what is happening. One thing that's being introduced is the use of drone technology. Now, that isn't something that is going to calm the fears of many of the protesters. Let's take a look at this report.
Officially, the reason police in France have used drones in Monday's demonstrations is to spot disruptive protesters. In several French cities, including Paris, Nantes and Bordeaux, authorities issued warrants which allow police to film protesters from the sky. In the capital, authorities feared there may be as many as 2,000 instigators.
Drones allow us to cover a much larger area, but under very strict conditions. You need an authorization. You have to be able to operate it correctly to ensure that people's freedoms are guaranteed under this measure.
But some human rights and lawyers' organisations are opposed to their use. They refer to courts because they're worried about footage being stored.
La loi prévoit qu'elles peuvent être conservées jusqu'à 7 jours.
The law will enable images to be kept for 7 days. So this raises the question of what will be done with them during this period. Will identities be kept private? And another question, which has not been answered by the warrants, is whether the drone films private spaces.
Des espaces privés.
The law specifies that drones can be used for crowd safety in public spaces, in the event of significant risk to public order. But it also sets restrictions, filming inside homes, as well as their entrances, recording sound, and using facial recognition. All courts which were referred to ultimately authorised drones to be used in Monday's protests. In Le Havre, however, a similar warrant was partially suspended.
Charlotte's report opens a Pandora's box, Richard, doesn't it? It's one of these things, because in one way society is becoming more and more Orwellian, George Orwell, etc., etc. On the other hand, we've had CCTV all over the place for a long time now.
True. Well, the answer of what the chief of police was saying, justifying the use of drone, is probably what happened today in Paris. Frankly speaking, I don't see much change. The drone use has not really changed the way of the police behaved in front of the protesters, and it has not helped to bring more calm in the protest, at least today. Now, one thing I wanted to say, a huge responsibility lies now in the end of the trade unions. The trade unions, not the political party, have been at the helm of this social protest. They have led this social protest from the beginning of January, as soon as Elizabeth Borne announced her intention to reform the pensions. So now what are they going to do? I think the leader of the CGT, Sophie Binet, said in an earlier report that we saw that they consider that the deadline is beginning of June, so it's 1 more month. So apparently they won't accept to go back to the Élysée or go back to Matignon to negotiate with the government. Now, what's going to happen during this month? Are they, the trade unions, in position to continue to protest? Or would it be better, maybe for the country, maybe also for the social situation, if they go and put down some requests beside the withdrawal of the pension reform? So I'm just wondering at what they are going to do. One very important thing that we didn't mention, which is quite extraordinary in France, is so far they have been united. The intersyndical, so 8 trade unions are working and moving together so far, including trade unions who have an history of adversity like CGT and CFDT. Are they going to remain united, and to do what? So we question a lot the attitude of the political parties. By the way, May Day today was also a day called Patriotic Day for the Rassemblement National. Every year they have this protest, this march, and they had it today. So, but let's look at the trade unions. There is responsibility in France on the side of the trade unions. The problem in this country is they are not as representative as they are in other countries. Only 10% of French employees are members of trade unions. But I heard today on the radio that the membership is increasing a lot due to the sympathy of the French people for those protests.
8% in France, 18% in the US, I read somewhere.
Exactly.
I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
I might be.
Yeah.
22% in the UK.
That's correct.
One wonders how the French union system has
So
such
if
strength.
this movement of protest manage to, let's say, get more people in the trade union movement, more employees, especially from the private sector in the trade union movement, frankly speaking, that would be good news. That would be good news because it will make the trade union stronger whenever they negotiate with the government. Apparently that's the case. But again, my question, what are they going to do in the month to come?
Indeed. We started with drones, moved on to union membership. It moves quickly in this debate. Lex, I know we're getting towards a final comment, so I'll let you loose. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think on the drones, it's a very interesting point that was made in the story about whether this should be public or not. I mean, my response as an American is let sunlight in, and if the drones are taking footage of potential conflicts that could be a source of civil litigation, the protesters suing the police, why not make it public footage?
But if you've got police body cam and it doesn't stop the police being, well, brutal.
I think there's a big question over whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, whether the body cams, personally, I think having more factual, objective information when it's a he said kind of scenario is helpful. But I think French people are much more sensitive to surveillance than we are in the Anglo-Saxon world. I mean, I'm also French now, so maybe I should be more sensitive to it. But the fact is that these drones give the possibility of some kind of neutral arbiter, but only, as you say, if it's not done in an Orwellian way where people feel spied on. I think it could be a source of neutral information of who actually was the instigator of violence. But I think it remains to be seen how it can be integrated into the public debate.
Claire, Big Brother is watching you.
Yes, well, I think it also begs the question of what kind of society we want, because clearly here we're in kind of an amplification of a securitization paradigm, and that is only necessary if we have societies where the level of tension is amplifying also. So the question, and it's the question of responsibility you raised, I believe that trade unions have been extremely responsible because they are representing not only the people who are with them directly, but also a whole majority of French people who want this movement to carry on, who have sympathy for the movement. So they're not going to let go if the country is not letting go, and the country is far from wanting to let go on this issue. So there's the responsibility, if one has to be pointed out here, I think is clearly on the government and on Emmanuel Macron, so that he stops using also all the tools of the Fifth Republic that can be a very vertical way of governing. So he kind of manages to hear what's going on and maybe withdraw this reform, which is the issue that's creating so much tension. I don't see any scenario where we can move on anything else if this hasn't been resolved.
Any chance of that happening, Lex?
Zero chance of it happening. I would say that the left and NUPES could still build a coalition. I mean, what Barack Obama always says when people boo is don't boo, vote, or don't boo, organize. I mean, if the left was as committed to creating new reforms as they were to contesting Macron's, I think they would have a chance at winning local elections, European elections, and maybe the next presidential election. And that would be, if I was a strategist for the left, I would put my attention there.
Indeed. Richard?
Well, as far as the drone, one thing I wanted to say is the importance of this drone surveillance will probably come in the time of when these protesters who are accused of attacking some buildings or who are being kept by the police will be in front of a judge, will be in front of the tribunal. Now, I do not know at the moment, and it's not been clear yet, will these images be provided now, immediately to the judge or not? Because we know in France a lot of these so-called either black box or black bloc or, let's say, attackers, they are being sent to justice immediately, very quickly. Now, will the judge be in possession of these images? Will the lawyer be in possession of these images? That's a big question.
Big questions. That's what we specialise in here in the debate. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So all three of you, Richard Verley there, who ended our debate from Blick magazine, international columnist, great to see you. Next to Richard, Claire Lejeune, member of the NUPES Left Wing Coalition, currently doing the thesis. Thank you for bringing your insight into the game, and also to Lex Paulson, as ever, Executive Director, School of Collective Intelligence at the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco. Lex, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Most of all, thank you for watching. Do stay with us. We'll be covering more, of course, on all these issues and all the news here live from Paris. Do stay with us. Bye.